"Sir, you need to move back to economy before this gets ugly." The words sliced through the quiet hum of business class just seconds before the slap echoed across the cabin. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the man clutching a glass of ginger ale 3 rows ahead. Not the elderly woman beneath the reading light near the window. Not even the little boy halfway down the aisle whose headphones had slipped crooked over one ear. 38,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, inside Flight 908 bound for New York, the entire cabin froze in a silence so sudden it almost felt physical. Elijah Brooks slowly turned his face back toward the flight attendant, his jaw tight beneath the soft amber glow of the overhead lights. His glasses had landed sideways near the armrest beside him after the turbulence jolted the aircraft. One lens was cracked. The woman standing above him kept her chin lifted high, one hand still gripping the service card, as if she needed it to steady herself. Claire Whitmore had perfected that expression years ago. Cold professionalism mixed with practiced superiority. Her navy uniform looked flawless beneath the cabin lights, every silver button polished, every strand of blonde hair locked perfectly into place. "I warned you twice," she said sharply, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You don't touch another passenger's belongings." Elijah looked down toward the designer handbag lying partially open beside his polished black shoes. A lipstick tube had rolled beneath the seat during turbulence. He had only bent down to pick it up before the woman across the aisle accused him of trying to steal from her. Now dozens of eyes stared at him from every direction. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some already judgmental. Elijah said nothing. That silence unsettled Claire more than anger would have. Most people argued. Most people defended themselves. Most people raised their voices when embarrassed in public. But this man simply adjusted the cuff of his charcoal hoodie and slowly straightened in his seat. Outside the oval windows, lightning flashed silently through distant storm clouds, illuminating the dark Atlantic sky in pale blue streaks. The plane shuddered lightly again. Somewhere near the galley, ice rattled inside a metal bin. Claire crossed her arms. "Sir, I'm speaking to you." Elijah finally lifted his eyes toward her. Calm, steady, tired. "I picked up her lipstick," he said quietly. "That's all." The passenger beside the window scoffed under her breath. "Sure you did." Claire immediately seized the moment. Exactly the kind of excuse I expected. A few uncomfortable murmurs spread through the cabin. Phones slowly appeared between seats now. Tiny glowing screens angled toward the confrontation. Elijah noticed them immediately but didn't react. Instead, his gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph tucked halfway inside the passport resting on his tray table. The corner of an old picture showed a smiling black woman standing beside an airport janitor cart sometime in the early 1990s. His mother. Claire followed his eyes and misread the silence as weakness. "You people always think rules don't apply to you once you sneak into first class." The second the words left her mouth, the atmosphere inside business class changed completely. Even the engines suddenly seemed quieter. A man near the aisle lowered his newspaper slowly. Across the cabin, a young flight attendant standing near the beverage station went pale. Elijah's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the armrest. Not enough for anger. Just enough to reveal something underneath the calm. The little boy 3 rows back whispered to his mother. Why did she say that? No one answered him. Claire leaned closer now, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening. "I can have security waiting the second we land." Elijah looked at her for several long seconds. Then, without raising his voice once, he asked, "Would you like to check the cabin cameras before deciding what kind of man I am?" Claire laughed immediately, sharp and humorless. "Oh, now you want procedure?" Another ripple of turbulence shook the aircraft harder this time. Several passengers grabbed their armrests instinctively. A flight chime sounded overhead. But nobody cared about the turbulence anymore. Because the man sitting quietly in seat 2A had just become the center of the entire plane's attention, and somewhere far below the clouds, the first upload of the slap video had already begun spreading across the internet. The seatbelt sign chimed again as the aircraft pushed through another pocket of rough air, but the tension inside business class had already become heavier than the storm outside. Elijah Brooks leaned back slowly into seat 2A, one hand resting near the cracked glasses on his tray table, while the soft glow from the overhead reading lamp carved sharp shadows across his face. Around him, Whispers spread carefully between passengers like smoke. Nobody spoke directly to him anymore. They only glanced, judged, assumed. Claire Whitmore stood near the beverage cart pretending to reorganize cups that did not need reorganizing, but her eyes kept drifting back toward Elijah every few seconds. Something about him unsettled her now. It was not fear exactly. It was the calm. Men who got caught usually argued louder. They defended themselves. They demanded managers. This man simply sat there breathing evenly while half the cabin stared at him like he had become some kind of public spectacle. The young flight attendant near the galley finally stepped closer to Claire and lowered her voice. "Claire, maybe we should review the footage before this goes any further." Claire did not even look at her. "I know exactly what I saw." But the passenger dropped the lipstick during turbulence. Claire snapped the drawer shut harder than necessary. And now everybody suddenly wants to defend him. The younger attendant went silent immediately. Elijah heard every word, but kept his eyes on the rain streaking across the oval window beside him. Beyond the glass, thunderclouds rolled endlessly through the darkness like mountains floating above the ocean. He had seen skies like this before. 23 years earlier, his mother used to work overnight janitorial shifts at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, while storms rattled the terminal windows after midnight. He still remembered sitting beside her mop bucket as a child, doing homework under fluorescent lights, while businessmen in expensive suits walked past them without ever making eye contact. "People show you who they are when they think you are beneath them," she used to whisper while wringing out cleaning towels with tired hands. Never forget that. Elijah slowly reached into his passport holder again and looked at the photograph tucked inside. Naomi Brooks stood smiling in front of gate C12 wearing a faded airport maintenance jacket 2 sizes too large for her shoulders. The picture had softened with age. The corners were bent white from years of folding and unfolding. Across the aisle, the woman whose lipstick had fallen earlier suddenly shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had started replaying the confrontation in her mind now that adrenaline was fading. The black man never raised his voice, never threatened anyone, never even stood up aggressively. He had simply bent down during turbulence. That was all. Her stomach tightened. A notification sound suddenly echoed from somewhere farther back in the cabin. Then another. Then another. Passengers began glancing down at their phones almost simultaneously. One college-aged man near row 4 stared wide-eyed at his screen before quickly lowering the brightness. The video was spreading fast now. The slap. Claire's voice. The phrase, "you people." Millions of people on the ground were already watching the airline unravel in real time while the aircraft itself still floated above the Atlantic. Up front near the cockpit door, one of the senior crew members answered an incoming satellite call. The color drained slowly from his face as he listened. "Understood," he whispered tightly before hanging up. He turned immediately toward Claire. "The captain needs to see you. Now." Claire frowned. "For what?" The man hesitated just long enough to make her chest tighten. Corporate operations called the cockpit directly. The entire cabin seemed quieter suddenly. Even the engines sounded distant now. Claire glanced once more toward Elijah. He was still sitting there calmly beneath the soft amber lights with his mother's photograph resting lightly between his fingers. Then for the first time since the confrontation began, Claire noticed the small engraving on the leather passport holder beside him. Brooks. Global Holdings. Claire Whitmore had spent 11 years building the kind of authority that made people obey without question. Inside the polished world of luxury airlines, appearance was everything, and Claire understood that better than anyone. Perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect smile for first-class passengers who wore expensive watches and smelled like private lounges and 12-year bourbon. She had memorized the habits of wealth the same way other people memorized prayers. The rich moved differently, spoke differently, belonged naturally. At least that was what she believed. And Elijah Brooks did not fit the image she trusted. Not with the worn charcoal hoodie resting against the cream leather seat. Not with the old carry-on bag scuffed at the corners. Not with the tired eyes of a man who looked more familiar with overnight shifts than executive boardrooms. Claire stood outside the cockpit now with her arms folded tightly as the aircraft vibrated beneath another wave of turbulence. The senior purser beside her kept glancing nervously toward the satellite phone mounted near the cabin wall. "Corporate operations has called 3 times, he whispered. "They specifically asked about the passenger in seat 2A. Claire forced a short laugh that sounded thinner than she intended. Probably some social media nonsense. Somebody uploads one dramatic video, and suddenly everybody panics. But even she no longer believed her own confidence completely. More notifications kept appearing across passengers' phones every minute. One businessman near row 3 quietly turned his screen away when Claire walked past, but not before she caught the headline flashing across it. Mid-flight incident goes viral. Another notification followed immediately beneath it. Alleged racial discrimination on Skylux Airlines Flight 908. Claire's stomach tightened. The younger flight attendant approached carefully again. Claire, maybe you should apologize before this gets worse. Claire turned sharply. For doing my job? You slapped a passenger. I reacted because he touched another customer's property. He picked up lipstick during turbulence. Claire's expression hardened instantly. You were not standing there when it happened. The younger woman hesitated. Neither were you. That silence landed harder than the turbulence. Claire stared at her for several long seconds before walking away without answering. Back inside business class, Elijah remained seated quietly while the storm outside painted silver flashes across the windows every few moments. He had not touched the drink sitting untouched beside his tray table. The ice had already melted halfway down the glass. Across the aisle, the woman with the designer handbag finally gathered enough courage to speak. Sir, she said softly, I think maybe this got out of hand. Elijah looked toward her calmly. Maybe. The woman swallowed hard. You were only helping. He nodded once, but said nothing else. That somehow made her feel even worse. 2 rows back, a middle-aged man in a navy suit suddenly leaned toward another passenger and whispered, Brooks Global Holdings owns aviation infrastructure in 12 states. The other man frowned. What? Look him up. The passenger quickly typed on his phone beneath the dim cabin light. Seconds later, his eyes widened visibly. Across the cabin, people slowly began searching the same name. Elijah noticed it happening 1 row at a time, like dominoes quietly falling. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Nobody laughed. Even the little boy from earlier now stared curiously toward seat 2, while his mother lowered her phone with trembling hands. Claire re-entered business class, trying desperately to regain control of the atmosphere. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced with forced professionalism, we appreciate your patience while we address a misunderstanding. Elijah finally looked up at her fully again. Calm, steady, exhausted. A misunderstanding, he repeated quietly. Claire ignored the question. For everyone's safety, we may need to relocate certain passengers temporarily. The room went still again. The words sounded polished, corporate, rehearsed. But underneath them sat the same ugly assumption she had carried from the beginning. Elijah slowly reached for his cracked glasses and unfolded them carefully. One lens caught the cabin light like fractured ice. You still think this is about a seat, he said softly. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before a single word came out, the overhead intercom crackled alive. Miss Whitmore, the captain's voice said tightly across the cabin. Report to the cockpit immediately. Claire Whitmore stepped into the cockpit with the controlled posture of someone refusing to admit panic, but the moment the reinforced door sealed behind her, the illusion cracked. Captain Leonard Hayes stood near the instrument panel with one hand pressed against his headset, while storm clouds flashed beyond the windshield in pale electric bursts. The cockpit itself felt smaller now, tighter, filled with the tense static of overlapping voices from corporate headquarters. Tell me this is being exaggerated online, Claire said immediately. The captain looked at her carefully before lowering the headset. Do you know who that passenger is? Claire crossed her arms defensively. Apparently, everybody suddenly thinks he is important. He is important. Another voice burst through the speaker mounted beside the navigation display. Sharp. Urgent. Captain Hayes, has Miss Whitmore been removed from passenger interaction yet? Claire's stomach dropped when she recognized the voice. Daniel Mercer, chairman of Skylux Airlines. One of the most powerful executives in American aviation. The captain answered cautiously. She is here now, sir. Good, Mercer snapped. Keep her there. Claire stepped closer to the console. Mr. Mercer, with respect, nobody has heard my side of this. Silence crackled across the line for one long second. Then Mercer spoke again, slower this time. Your side. Behind him, muffled voices shouted over one another somewhere inside corporate headquarters. Phones rang endlessly. Claire could almost hear keyboards clattering through the speaker. Miss Whitmore, Mercer continued. The man sitting in seat 2A owns 48% of Brooks Global Holdings. Claire blinked once. I do not know what that has to do with this. The captain stared at her in disbelief. Mercer exhaled heavily. Brooks Global Holdings financed the last restructuring deal that kept this airline from bankruptcy 2 years ago. The words landed like ice water. Claire suddenly felt the aircraft humming beneath her feet again. No, she whispered automatically. That cannot be right. His mother cleaned terminals for this company for 27 years, Mercer continued. And tonight, half the internet watched one of our senior attendants publicly humiliate her son. Claire's mouth went dry. Outside the cockpit windows, lightning illuminated the clouds again in violent silver flashes, but inside the silence became even worse. Sir, the captain interrupted carefully. The video has reached national media. Mercer muttered something under his breath that neither of them fully caught. Our stock dropped 11% in the last 7 minutes, he finally said. Investors are pulling out live on financial television. Legal teams are already preparing emergency statements. Claire grabbed the edge of the jump seat to steady herself. I did not know who he was. The response came instantly. That is exactly the problem. Back in business class, Elijah Brooks remained seated quietly while passengers openly searched his name now. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Earlier, they had stared at him with suspicion. Now they watched with nervous fascination, as though they suddenly realized they had witnessed something irreversible. A businessman near row 4 lowered his phone slowly after reading the latest headline aloud under his breath. Skylux Airlines facing discrimination backlash after viral mid-flight incident. Across the aisle, the woman with the designer handbag covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The young flight attendant quietly approached Elijah carrying a fresh pair of glasses from first-class amenities storage. Sir, she said softly, I thought these might help until landing. Elijah looked at the replacement frames for a moment before accepting them politely. Thank you. The young woman hesitated. I am sorry for what happened. Elijah studied her tired expression carefully. Unlike Claire, this woman looked genuinely shaken. Not because of money. Not because of corporate fallout. Because she knew it was wrong. Elijah nodded once. No. Up front, Claire finally found her voice again. What happens now? The chairman's answer came back cold and immediate. Right now, we survive the next 20 minutes. Then the line went dead. The aircraft began its gradual descent toward New York, but inside Skylux Airlines headquarters, 300 miles away, the company was already falling faster than the plane itself. Giant financial monitors glowed red across the executive conference room as analysts shouted over one another and television anchors dissected the viral footage frame by frame. Down 19%. Pulling another investor group now. Legal wants immediate statements approved. Civil rights organizations are already responding online. Daniel Mercer stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows gripping the edge of the conference table so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Below him, Manhattan shimmered beneath cold rain and ambulance lights. His phone would not stop vibrating. Board members, investors, reporters, politicians. Everyone wanted answers. And somewhere above the Atlantic, the center of the disaster sat quietly in seat 2A wearing a charcoal hoodie and holding an old photograph of his mother. Back on Flight 908, the atmosphere had become almost unbearable. Nobody watched movies anymore. Nobody ordered drinks. Business class looked less like a luxury cabin now and more like a waiting room outside a courtroom. Claire Whitmore remained locked inside the forward galley after the cockpit conversation, staring blankly at the silver coffee machine while her reflection trembled faintly across the polished metal surface. Her phone screen kept lighting up with notifications she was now too afraid to open. Friends asking questions. News alerts. Unknown numbers calling repeatedly. The younger flight attendant approached cautiously carrying a folded company tablet against her chest. Claire, she whispered gently, you should probably see this. Claire took the tablet with stiff hands. A live business channel filled the screen immediately. Behind the anchor, giant red numbers flashed beside Skylux Airlines stock prices. Industry experts are calling this one of the fastest public relations collapses in recent aviation history, the anchor reported. The viral video involving a senior flight attendant and black business executive Elijah Brooks has already surpassed 27 million views in under 15 minutes. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Elijah Brooks. Hearing the full name aloud somehow made everything more real. The tablet refreshed again automatically. Another headline appeared beneath it. Brooks Global Holdings suspends emergency aviation negotiations with Skylux. Claire sat down heavily on the jump seat. Oh God. The younger attendant lowered her voice. Corporate just terminated 2 regional executives. Claire stared upward blankly. For what? For previous discrimination complaints they buried last year. Silence settled heavily between them. Outside the galley curtain, passengers continued glancing toward Elijah with growing disbelief. He remained exactly where he had been the entire time. Calm, composed, quiet. The replacement glasses sat neatly on his face now, while soft cabin lights reflected against the cracked lens resting and used beside him. Across the aisle, the woman with the designer handbag finally leaned forward carefully. Mr. Brooks. Elijah looked toward her politely. Her voice shook slightly. I owe you an apology. Elijah studied her tired eyes for a moment before answering softly. Thank you. She swallowed hard. I should have spoken up sooner. Elijah glanced briefly around the cabin at all the lowered eyes and silent phones. Most people do not, he said quietly. That sentence seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. Near the front of the aircraft, the cockpit door opened suddenly. Captain Hayes stepped out with visible tension carved across his face. Every crew member straightened instantly. Even Claire stood. The captain looked directly at Elijah across the cabin. Mr. Brooks, he said carefully. The chairman of Skylux Airlines is requesting to speak with you immediately upon landing. The entire cabin listened in complete silence now. Elijah nodded once. I assumed he would. Claire stared at him from the galley entrance, her breathing shallow. Not once since the confrontation began had he tried to embarrass her publicly. Not once had he demanded revenge. Yet somehow that restraint made the shame feel heavier every passing minute. The captain hesitated before speaking again. Sir, there is also a request from corporate security asking whether you intend to pursue legal action. Elijah looked out the rain-streaked window where the first distant lights of New York shimmered beneath the storm clouds. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. Tired eyes. Gray at the temples now. The face of a man who had spent his whole life learning how to remain calm inside rooms that wanted him angry. Finally, he answered softly, almost to himself. I have not decided yet. The cabin lights dimmed automatically as Flight 908 began descending through thick storm clouds toward John F. Kennedy International Airport. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the entire aircraft fell into an uneasy quiet. Outside the windows, rain streaked endlessly across the glass, while distant lightning pulsed softly above the Atlantic like silent camera flashes. Elijah Brooks sat motionless beneath the amber reading light, one hand resting against the worn passport holder on his lap, while the engines hummed low beneath the floorboards. Around him, passengers had stopped whispering altogether. The earlier tension had transformed into something heavier now. Shame, reflection, discomfort. People avoided looking directly at him because doing so meant confronting what they had allowed themselves to believe only 20 minutes earlier. A black man in a hoodie sitting in first class had been enough to trigger suspicion before he had even spoken. Elijah understood that reality too well to act surprised anymore. Across the aisle, the woman with the designer handbag quietly wiped at her eyes before pretending to look out the window. 2 rows behind her, the little boy who had overheard everything earlier leaned toward his mother again. Why was everybody mean to him? He whispered softly. His mother opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Her face tightened with embarrassment because she did not know how to explain prejudice to a child, without exposing her own silence inside it. Near the front galley, Claire Whitmore stood alone now. The younger attendants had drifted away quietly, leaving her beside the coffee machine and stacks of untouched plastic cups. Her perfect uniform suddenly looked smaller somehow beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. Less powerful, less polished. She kept replaying the moment in her head over and over again. The slap, the silence afterward, the phrase she should never have said. You people. She had spent years believing prejudice belonged to louder, uglier people than her. People screaming on street corners. People caught on grainy videos online. Not women with perfect posture and employee awards framed inside airport lounges. But standing there now with her career collapsing somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, Claire finally understood something terrifying. Hatred did not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it smiled politely while making assumptions. Sometimes it wore expensive perfume and spoke in calm professional tones. Up in business class, Elijah slowly opened the passport holder again and stared at the faded photograph tucked inside. Naomi Brooks smiled back at him beneath fluorescent airport lights from nearly 3 decades ago. He could still remember the smell of industrial floor cleaner lingering on her hands when she hugged him after night shifts. Remember the sound of rolling suitcase wheels echoing through empty terminals after midnight. Remember sitting beside her janitor cart eating vending machine crackers while executives walked past without seeing either of them. Never let bitterness become your personality, she used to tell him softly whenever customers treated her like she was invisible. Because once hatred changes your heart, they win twice. Elijah closed his eyes briefly as turbulence rattled the aircraft again. For a moment, exhaustion settled heavily across his face. Not exhaustion from tonight. Exhaustion from years. From boardrooms where people assumed he was security. From luxury stores where employees followed him through aisles. From hotel lobbies where wealthy guests handed him their car keys without asking his name. Success had changed his bank account. It had never fully changed how certain people saw him. The captain's voice finally broke the silence overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our final approach into New York. Local weather conditions remain heavy, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Soft clicking sounds echoed across the cabin as passengers adjusted their belts. Elijah looked once more through the rain-streaked window where the blurred lights of Queens glowed faintly beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere below them, reporters already crowded airport terminals while financial analysts dissected the collapse unfolding in real time. But inside seat 2A, none of that seemed important anymore. Elijah gently touched the corner of his mother's photograph with his thumb and whispered quietly enough that only he could hear it. "You were right, Mom." The wheels touched the runway with a heavy shudder that rolled through the cabin like distant thunder, and for several long seconds nobody moved. Rain hammered against the aircraft windows while reverse engines roared beneath the floor, slowing the massive plane through sheets of water reflecting red and blue airport lights. Normally, passengers reached for phones the second a flight landed. Tonight, almost nobody did. They were already watching the story unfold in real time. As Flight 908 taxied slowly toward the terminal, the glow from hundreds of screens illuminated tense faces throughout the cabin. News alerts continued pouring in faster than people could read them. Skylux chairman announces emergency press conference. Brooks Global suspends all aviation partnerships. Former employees come forward with discrimination claims. Elijah Brooks remained seated quietly beside the rain-streaked window while the aircraft rolled past rows of blinking runway lights. His hands rested calmly on his lap now, the old photograph tucked safely back inside the passport holder. Across the aisle, passengers avoided meeting his eyes directly, not because they feared him, but because they feared what tonight revealed about themselves. Near the front galley, Claire Whitmore looked physically smaller than she had 3 hours earlier when the flight departed London. The perfect confidence was gone now. So was the sharpness in her posture. Her makeup had begun fading beneath tired eyes, and the silver wings pinned neatly above her uniform pocket suddenly looked heavy instead of prestigious. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Hayes stepped out carrying a folded document in one hand. Every crew member straightened instinctively. The captain's face remained carefully neutral, but tension sat visibly across his jaw. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "corporate headquarters has issued immediate termination effective upon landing." The words settled across the cabin in complete silence. Claire blinked once slowly as though her brain had not fully processed them. "Right now?" she whispered. The captain nodded. "Airport security and legal representatives are already waiting at the gate." Claire's breathing became shallow. 11 years, she said faintly, almost to herself. "I gave this airline 11 years. Nobody answered her, because somewhere deep down, everyone understood the truth already. This was no longer only about one moment on one flight. The collapse had started long before tonight. Tonight simply exposed it. Up ahead near the front row, A businessman suddenly looked up from his phone and muttered under his breath, "My God." Another passenger leaned toward him nervously. "What now?" The man turned his screen sideways so others could see. Live footage from Manhattan filled the display. Daniel Mercer stood behind a podium surrounded by flashing cameras, his tie loosened, his expression exhausted. Effective immediately, Mercer announced, "I am resigning as chairman of Skylux Airlines." Audible gasps spread softly through the cabin. Mercer continued speaking through the phone speaker while reporters shouted questions over one another. "This incident forced us to confront systemic failures within our company culture that should have been addressed years ago." Claire lowered herself slowly into the jump seat near the galley wall as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Elijah watched the screen quietly without satisfaction on his face. Only sadness. That seemed to affect people more than anger ever could have. The businessman kept reading updates aloud in disbelief. 3 executives removed. Federal review announced. Civil rights investigation possible. Stock suspended temporarily. One sentence after another. One collapse after another. The airline was imploding publicly before passengers had even unbuckled their seatbelts. The overhead chime finally sounded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes announced carefully, "welcome to New York." Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. Outside the rain-covered windows, airport vehicles flashed silently beneath the storm clouds while reporters gathered beyond the terminal glass, like shadows waiting for the doors to open. Claire slowly turned toward Elijah for the first time since landing. Her eyes looked hollow now beneath the cabin lights. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, struggling to keep her voice steady, "I truly did not understand who you were." Elijah looked at her calmly for several seconds before answering in the softest voice anyone had heard all night. That was never the problem. The cabin doors finally opened with a soft mechanical hiss, and the cold New York rain outside seemed to rush into the aircraft all at once. Flashing airport lights reflected across the wet tarmac beyond the terminal windows while reporters crowded behind security barriers near Gate 14, cameras already raised before the first passenger even stepped off the plane. Nobody moved immediately. Business class remained frozen in that strange, heavy silence that had followed the flight for the last hour. Then slowly, seatbelts clicked open one after another. Elijah Brooks remained seated a few moments longer while passengers gathered bags carefully around him, almost respectfully now. Across the aisle, the woman with the designer handbag paused before leaving. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "for whatever it is worth, I am sorry I stayed quiet." Elijah looked up at her tired expression beneath the dim cabin lights. "Most people are," he answered gently. The woman lowered her eyes and walked away without another word. Near the front galley, Claire Whitmore stood beside 2 airport security officers and a corporate legal representative wearing a dark gray suit soaked slightly from the rain outside. Nobody had handcuffed her. Nobody needed to. The devastation on her face already looked heavier than punishment. She watched passengers pass through the doorway while reporters' camera flashes flickered through the jet bridge windows like distant lightning. The younger flight attendant approached Elijah quietly as he finally stood from seat 2A. "Sir," she said nervously, "there is a private exit arranged for you downstairs if you want to avoid the media." Elijah slipped his mother's photograph carefully back into the passport holder before answering. "Thank you, but I will walk out normally." The young woman nodded slowly, understanding something unspoken inside his response. Elijah lifted his worn carry-on bag from beneath the seat and moved calmly down the aisle while passengers stepped aside instinctively to let him pass. No arrogance, no performance, just quiet dignity moving through a cabin that had spent hours underestimating him. Claire watched him approach until he finally stopped a few feet away from her near the aircraft door. For a second, neither spoke. The rain outside drummed softly against the jet bridge walls while airport vehicles blinked silently across the wet runway. Claire's voice cracked slightly when she finally spoke. "I do not expect forgiveness." Elijah studied her face carefully. Without the polished confidence and rehearsed smile, she suddenly looked painfully human now. Tired, frightened, ashamed. "Good," he answered softly. Claire swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Elijah nodded once. "Yes." The honesty landed between them without cruelty attached to it. That somehow made it harder to bear. Claire looked down at the silver airline wings pinned above her chest pocket. I keep thinking about what you said. Elijah waited quietly. Her eyes filled slowly with tears. She seemed embarrassed to show that this was never about a seat. For the first time all night, Elijah's expression softened slightly. No, he said gently. It was about what made you assume I did not belong in one. Claire closed her eyes briefly as those words settled into her. Completely. Around them, even the security officers remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed the moment. Elijah adjusted the strap on his carry-on bag and glanced once through the rain-covered terminal windows where reporters continued gathering beyond security checkpoints. Then he looked back at Claire one final time. Do you know the hardest part? He asked quietly. Claire shook her head. Elijah's voice remained calm, almost painfully calm. You only treated me this way because cameras were not supposed to matter. Claire's breathing caught. How many people before me never had millions of people watching? The question hollowed the air around them. No accusation could have struck harder than that simple truth. Claire lowered her head slowly, unable to answer because both of them already knew the answer was probably too many. Elijah gave a small nod toward the security officers beside her. Not cruel, not triumphant, just finished. Then he turned and walked calmly into the jet bridge while the storm outside continued washing cold rain across the airport lights of New York City. The terminal beyond Gate 14 looked nothing like the polished advertisements hanging from its walls. Rainwater streaked across the towering glass windows while television crews crowded behind temporary barriers, shouting questions that dissolved into echoes beneath the high steel ceilings of John F. Kennedy International Airport. Camera flashes burst constantly like white lightning against the marble floors. Security officers moved quickly through the corridor, trying to contain the chaos, but the story had already spread too far. Screens above the terminal now carried live coverage from every major network. Analysts debated corporate accountability. Former employees described years of ignored complaints. Hashtags demanding reform crawled endlessly beneath breaking news banners. Yet in the middle of all that noise, Elijah Brooks walked quietly through the airport carrying a worn black duffel bag over one shoulder like an ordinary traveler returning home from a long trip. No entourage surrounded him. No bodyguards cleared the path. Passengers simply moved aside instinctively when they recognized him. Some lowered their eyes. Others whispered apologies he never stopped long enough to hear. Near the escalators, Daniel Mercer waited beside two exhausted legal advisors, his expensive suit wrinkled now beneath harsh fluorescent lighting. The chairman looked 20 years older than he had on television only an hour earlier. When Elijah approached, Mercer stepped forward carefully. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, I owe you more apologies than I can put into words. Elijah stopped, but did not speak immediately. Around them, reporters shouted questions from behind barricades while rain rattled softly against the terminal glass. Mercer swallowed hard. What happened tonight should never have happened. Elijah finally looked at him. No, he answered calmly. It should not have. Mercer nodded slowly, shame visible across his face. The board voted 30 minutes ago. We are opening full investigations into every discrimination complaint filed over the last decade. Elijah said nothing. Mercer lowered his voice further. And for what it is worth, your mother was respected here. That finally made Elijah's expression shift slightly. Not anger, not triumph, just something quieter. Sadness mixed with memory. No, Elijah said softly. She was tolerated here. Mercer looked down immediately because he knew the difference. Silence settled between them while airport announcements echoed faintly overhead. Final boarding calls. Delayed departures. Ordinary life continuing around extraordinary collapse. Then Elijah reached slowly into his passport holder and removed the old photograph once more. Naomi Brooks smiled beneath faded airport lights from decades earlier, standing beside a janitor cart with tired eyes and worn sneakers. Elijah looked at the picture for several seconds before turning away from the reporters, away from the cameras, away from the executives still scrambling to save what remained of their company. Down near the far end of the terminal, an elderly janitor pushed a cleaning cart slowly across the polished floor beneath the dim midnight lights. His gray uniform hung loosely from tired shoulders, and headphones played soft gospel music no one else could hear. Elijah walked toward him quietly. The old man glanced up briefly, then froze completely. Recognition filled his face almost instantly. "Naomi," he whispered when he saw the photograph. Elijah nodded once. The janitor removed his headphones slowly with trembling hands. "Lord have mercy," he breathed. "I worked nights with her back in Terminal 3. Elijah smiled faintly for the first time all night. "She used to bring me here after school sometimes." The old man stared at the picture with wet eyes. "Your mama was one of the kindest people in this airport." Around them, the terminal continued buzzing with distant reporters and breaking news alerts, but somehow the noise felt far away now. Elijah carefully handed the photograph to the old janitor for a closer look. The man held it gently like something sacred beneath the cold fluorescent glow. Neither man spoke for a while after that. They simply stood together beside the cleaning cart while rain slid down the giant terminal windows and planes moved silently through the darkness outside. And somewhere beyond the glass, above the storm-soaked runway lights of New York City, dawn was beginning to rise.